I'm joined today by Adam Verwey, the former founder of Future Super, who is about to launch his new venture, Six. Adam got his start in the finance industry at Australian Ethical, and he's known by many as one of the most progressive and sustainability-minded leaders in the finance industry. Future Super as a group now manages north of $15 billion for over 100,000 Australians. What Future Super is best known for is its strong anti-fossil fuels and sustainability investment positions, which adorn almost all of its marketing materials today. What's more interesting than Adam's professional achievements are his unusually progressive views about the role that money should play in creating a world where opportunities aren't just available to those who are born into privilege, which is exactly where I want to start. Adam, you were born in the heart of outback Australia. Can you tell me what it was like growing up in Broken Hill?
Yeah, it's an interesting place to live. It's a mining town, and it's very hard to forget it's a mining town because the mine is literally on the main street. You've got this enormous hill made up of tailings that have come out of the mine, and that sits right in the middle of town. So it's interesting to live in a place like that. And it's also a very isolated place, technically part of New South Wales, but a good 12 to 13 hours drive away from Sydney, and you get to experience what it's like to have a lot of distance between you and a lot of infrastructure that exists elsewhere, particularly at that time that we didn't have in Broken Hill.
What did you do to pass the time in the middle of absolutely nowhere?
I love playing sport, and living in the country is a great place to play sport. And also just had a few friends who we just love going out camping every other weekend. We'd just go and grab our tents, and we'd get our parents to drop us off at the side of the road, a few kilometres out of town, and we just find a place to go camping. For someone like me, I couldn't imagine a better childhood than being able to spend it in places where I could just be outdoors a lot and be with friends. I think when you grow up in that kind of environment, you find it very hard to imagine what it's like for people who grow up in the city, where maybe they don't have that freedom of movement and the space and things that I was lucky enough to have.
Growing up in a relatively small country town, what's the perspective like? Is it one where you're raised to look outward into the world and expand your horizons, or is it naturally a more introspective place?
I think it can be hard to understand what happens outside of where you live because you don't get a lot of exposure to that. There was kids that I went to school with who hadn't been to a capital city, hadn't seen the ocean, which makes it sort of an interesting challenge to think of how do you think about things outside of where you live. But for me and a lot of my friends who were thinking about how do we have jobs and careers and opportunities that weren't in mining, we knew that we had to find a way to do well in school and well enough to leave and go to another city where we could go to university. And I think, unfortunately, the trajectory of that is if you do that, the chances of you coming back to that town are slim to none.
Have you still got family there?
No, my family left there a few years after I finished high school. They're just now in a small town just outside of Adelaide.
Now, you are in the finance industry, which we'll get onto in a little bit. How do you think you found your way there from Broken Hill? What was your first experience with the finance industry? Was it something you experienced from a young age, or is it something that you took a while to have your first exposure to?
Growing up in Broken Hill, you're very aware of the mythology of places like Broken Hill, that these are really important places in terms of our nation building. And you think, well, it hasn't necessarily benefited my town. A lot of people died in those mines. They weren't safe places to work. And they were mining things including lead. And that lead is very dangerous to people who work around it and also to people who grow up in those areas. The impacts of elevated levels of lead in people's bodies was causing a lot of damage to kids I went to school with. And it creates this ongoing problem that people who are being impacted by the lead from those mines might then have learning difficulties that may make it difficult to have jobs other than working in the mines later on. And you've got this cycle going on. And you think, well, this mining kind of sucks, but there's this idea that it's benefiting everybody. And so therefore it's okay. But when we had this investing game when I was in school, you know, the ones where you get given a theoretical $1,000 and you pick a few stocks and you see how it works. BHP was the biggest company in Australia at the time. The BH stands for Broken Hill. And this is now one of the biggest companies, not just in Australia, but in the world. And you sort of start to realize this was a few people getting very, very rich, building a hundreds of billions of dollar company out of this town by extracting from this town who didn't see the benefit from it. And you just have this sort of feeling of unfairness.
Was there a particular moment you can recall or a specific person that started you off on that path towards asking more complex questions than most people ask in their career trajectory around maybe contributing more to the world than you take from it?
That was a particular moment for me, recognizing that this huge company came out of the town that I lived in. And therefore, why wasn't the town I lived in like amazing? Why didn't it reflect the town that this really huge business came from? Why wasn't the wealth in my town? I think I also just had a lot of influence from my parents, who I felt had really important jobs, but didn't seem to be compensated in a way that reflected their importance. My mum, she works in care industries her whole life, either caring for children, caring for elderly, and she's been compensated poorly throughout her entire career. It doesn't reflect the importance of her work. I know it was true for me, and I know it's true for many people, that as you get older, you sort of appreciate the unfairness of it a bit more.
One of the questions I ask pretty much everyone I speak to is, do you think your drive to make positive change in the world is reactive to seeing unfair things happening around you and being angry about that? Or is it proactive about wanting to make a positive contribution because that's what you find fulfilling?
I think like you want to say, but it's positive and it's proactive. But yeah, I'm definitely really triggered by seeing unfairness. It definitely motivates me, gets me fired up, gets me worked up, and I want to make good on that unfairness. It just really angers me to see people being not just okay with unfairness, but deliberately exploiting it. By my nature, I'm actually really positive, proactive. Like I like to consider myself that way, but I definitely feel like the fuel for what I work on and what I've chosen to work on has definitely come as a reaction to the unfairness.
You started your career in finance at Australian Ethical, which is a for-profit superannuation and investment company that's listed on the Australian Stock Exchange and which fashions itself as perhaps the most ethical provider in the market. Can you tell us a bit more about your 8 years there, and what was it about that experience that led to you starting Future Super?
I got involved there in the first place because at my university, I got involved in student politics. So when I identified this unfairness, I didn't really think of it as like, oh, I'm going to spend my career working on this. At the time, I was like, oh, well, I guess like you sort things out through politics. So I joined some political groups on campus, and then I got involved in the student unions. And then through the student unions, I had someone who was on the student committee with me sort of say, let's all look at our super and where it's invested. And I saw BHP as the biggest holding in my superannuation fund. And switched to Australian Ethical and their superannuation fund at the time. It actually just felt really great about it. I know that it was literally dollars of, of shares that got traded out of BHP as a result of that decision, and it made no difference at all. But personally, it made me feel great to feel like with what little power I had, I moved my money out of BHP and into something else with Australian Ethical. And then uniquely enough, because I went to university in Canberra, and Australian Ethical had their head office right next door to my university. So I sort of loved that experience so much, I just went and applied and started working there really soon after. And I took one of those jobs that most people would hate, where you're the lowest rung person in the office. You're working across 4 different teams with 4 different managers. But instead of seeing it as this shit job where I had 4 bosses, it was actually this really amazing experience where I got to work across marketing, funds administration, sales, and also worked really directly with one of the founders on a bunch of projects he was working on at the time. And it just gave me this background in every single part of what it takes to build and run managed funds and superannuation. And because I got to work so closely with a few of the founders as well, really got to see how they thought about things and how they did things, what was important to them. And you also get to see how they thought a little bit differently to people who were employed in those management and executive roles as well. Like the people who were founders, they just absolutely cared about every detail. The level of passion was different as well. And also because everybody wanted access to the founders, it also made me a little bit more important. I might have been that lowly paid person in the office, but I had this access that sort of also got me involved in a few other opportunities I wouldn't otherwise. I chose while I was there a bit longer to really focus on the distribution, the business development and sales. And the opportunity that gave to me was the opportunity to speak to like hundreds and thousands of ethical investors. As a result of that, it gave me this really great knowledge about what regular ethical investors were looking for in their financial services and their superannuation, what excited them. And so I just think that was a really lucky experience to be able to have that many conversations. I know I've read 10,000 hours doing something can make you an expert in something. I think maybe my 10,000 hours was I spent that many hours chatting to people directly about ethical investing. And that direct experience of talking to so many people let me know at that time that the fossil fuel divestment movement was really growing at a great rate, and that people cared very deeply about their superannuation not being exposed to fossil fuels, and that they saw their superannuation as one of the most powerful things they could use to make a difference on climate. And that sort of became what Future Super ended up being born out of, was just like, I had just so much confidence that Future Super was a great idea because I just felt like I'd had so many conversations validating it.
What was the decision point that led to Future Super? How did you get there? Where was the need that you saw?
So around 2013, I ran in the federal election as a Greens candidate. I went for one of the lower house seats where the Greens aren't going to win. But in Canberra, there was a chance that they could win a Senate spot, the Senate spot that David Pocock now has. So even back in 2013, there was an idea that a progressive candidate could take that from the right. And the person who was running for that seat ended up being my co-founder at Future Super. It was Simon Sheikh. He'd been the national director at Get Up. And I spent a year with him campaigning as part of that campaign. Got really energized about it, getting to be a part of like this really big effort to do community building and persuasion and really connecting with people about the importance of winning a seat and what it could mean for all sorts of issues. And as part of that process, just sort of said, like, I reckon we could apply this to ethical investing. And this could be the thing that helps ethical investing grow from 1 to 2% of total funds under management to doing much, much more, which is like talking to people exactly what they're excited about. And really, climate action was the big thing. Australian ethical and all these other ethical funds are all sort of like broadly ethical. Like they're not going to invest in tobacco or almonds and things like that. But the thing that like people were super motivated by was climate. So it was important to be broadly ethical, but really hone in on climate. And if you gave people an opportunity to invest in something that was free of fossil fuels and where they felt like their decision to move could have a domino effect in terms of prompting other super funds to change how they invest, that would be something really powerful that we could tap into. And we actually pitched this idea to Australian Ethical, but we pitched it to them first and said, we're pretty good on fossil, you don't invest in coal, but if you just got rid of all the rest of your fossil fuels, there's an opportunity to really capture this big audience who are interested and be part of this movement. And there's an opportunity to promote yourself in more of a movement building way, rather than just like something that matches people's ethics. Ultimately, they weren't interested in that at the time. And we then had to go down the process of working out how to build a super fund.
How does one do that? It sounds like for people who exist within the financial services industry, they will know that is probably one of the hardest businesses to start. What was the starting point?
Yeah, so it's interesting thing. So I had a pretty good idea of how to run a super fund that already existed at a day-to-day level. So I felt like if a fund's already up and running, I got a pretty good idea and I'm pretty confident I could do it. But then we had to work out how do you actually build it in the first place. I think we were helped by a little bit of naivety about the size of the challenge. And then we just got this major lucky break. So the only other super fund I'd ever heard of being started was this really tiny super fund called Cruelty Free Super, which was like a vegan superannuation fund. So I contacted him and asked him, like, how did you start? He introduced us to this company in Potts Point, who just happened to have this amazing infrastructure where they could bring super funds to market. And the way it worked was that technically Future Super, when we began, Future Super, the company, we were really just the promoter of a fund. So we were responsible for the marketing and growth of the fund and sort of creating the investment mandate. But all the other pieces were done by somebody else that was part of this infrastructure. So we had a different investment manager, there was a different administrator.
So that really allowed you to focus on that distribution that you'd been really experienced in at Australian Ethical.
Yeah, we really focused on that. And then we took on a few of the administration bits to start with as well. In particular, we built the first fully online join process. Until then, switching super funds was a major pain, like paperwork, sending forms away. You make a mistake on that form and they're just going to deny your role. Yeah.
I was building my first fintech in 2014, and I can remember just the complexity of digital AML or ID verification back in the day. It was so difficult, and trying to embed everything into your own systems. It was before APIs. You had to build everything, so that would have been quite a challenge.
Yeah, no, it was a challenge. We also tried to start a second business at the same time called Future Home Loans, which was about trying to switch people into home loans with fossil fuel-free banks. We had this theory of change that if we potentially switched 1,000 home loans away from the big banks, it would be meaningful enough that they would change their fossil fuel lending practices. But mortgage broking was even more paper-based than superannuation was. And all of the non-Big Four bank lenders were just the absolute worst with their tech capabilities. So we felt like we had this big funnel of people who could start the process, and the bottleneck just never opened up. So that was this sort of like little failed business that we tried to start at the same time as we started a super fund. But back on Future Super, yeah, and then over time we sort of brought in all those other elements that a super fund has. Over time we became sort of the administrator, over time became the investment manager.
How close during those early years at Future Super did you come to failure?
Yeah, like a few times. Like one of the big ones was it will sound silly in hindsight, but from the moment that I put in my resignation from Australian Ethical, we thought we could have a super fund up and running in a month or two. It ended up taking us 9 months. But if your starting point is this is going to be up and running in 2 or 3 months, every time that drags on, every time you get the no to launching and it feels out of your hands, feels like that death knell on your business. Yeah. And so that was probably the times when we were closest, just thinking, actually, are we just not going to get past the starting line? And then after we got up and running, we never had a shortage of people joining the fund. Our acquisition rate was amazing from day one, but we were not entrepreneurs. We didn't come from startup communities. We're in Canberra. Like we didn't even know founders. And so the pathway to raising funds, and like I know now as an experienced founder what that looks like, what the steps look like, but we just didn't. And so we did an angel round, but we never did another formal round for ages. So we always kept raising a little bit of money right at the last minute, right at the point where Simon and I would think, do we have to keep tipping more ourselves in? We were not people who came from wealth. We didn't really have the means to do it. I remember we had this cash flow document that went down to like the day. So we could look ahead over the next 6 months and to the very day know when our crunch points were. Yep. And they probably lasted for the first couple of years. But yeah, after that point, I think we always had a pathway to knowing when we could be profitable if we weren't intent on growing at a really hard rate and wanting to invest in that growth.
You've had a front row seat in seeing how an impact company's priorities change as it takes on investors. How did you see Future Super change as it took on investment, for better and for worse?
Yeah, and it's one of the things that really led me to wanting to do Six now is just realizing just how challenging it is to build an impact business and then have to keep raising funds over a journey and increasingly larger funds from people who have larger amounts of money, and how hard it is to stay true to your impact goals and stay really aligned to them. Our original investors, like our angel investors, you could not meet people any more aligned with what Future Super's goals and missions were. They were people who absolutely loved us. They were people who would like donate to the Greens and they'd turn up to Extinction Rebellion events. They were people who had impact businesses themselves. And they would be people who would join the Future Super Fund. They were people who would be the stakeholders and members of our own fund that we were building and understood what we were wanting to build. And to be honest, they weren't really thinking, I want 100 times or 1,000 times return. They're thinking, I want this to exist. And I believe in Simon and Adam, and I believe that they can make change. And so that's what they were really backing. And we also, through like our next few rounds over the next few years, had people who just really backed us to make big change. And we're more focused on us building a great business and a really impactful business more so than anything else.
Yeah.
But I guess there comes a point where suddenly you're doing something that's labeled a Series A and then a Series B and a Series C. And now in their most recent raise, they're raising tens of millions of dollars. And there's just only so many groups of people out there who have tens of millions of dollars or can write $1 million checks. It's a very small community of people. And A lot of them have investment mandates that say that they want you to try and get to a 100x type return or something in a certain period of time. And they get preference rights as part of investing a lot of money in your business as well. Preferences and rights that other shareholders who came in earlier, who took on more risk because you're a smaller, riskier company, and they get rights above that, which might be board positions, could be liquidity preferences, all sorts of things. But after you've gone through a few rounds, and if all those people who led your Series A, Series B, Series C are all on your board, then you suddenly have a board that's dominated by large investors who have an investment mandate that wants to get a certain return. That the reason why they wanted to be on your board was to help ensure that you're committed to getting them that return. And your ability to have conversations about the importance of impact and the absolute maximization of return over short periods of time just might not align. And so one of the reasons why I chose to leave Future Super was they decided to go on a mergers and acquisition strategy to buy up the super funds, which has been a financially rewarding strategy for that company. I felt there was more impact to be had by focusing on Future Super and our core ethical brand. That was more important to our theory of change, of changing the $4 trillion in superannuation. So that was sort of the decision that made me left. Their acquisition strategy has proven to be very financially rewarding for that company. But to me, that's a different theory of change to trying to be the fund that pushes so hard on the rest of the industry that they have to change the way that they invest.
Some of your former colleagues have said that one of the great things about you is that you're willing to make bold statements on behalf of the companies that you're responsible for. I wonder if I can ask you about the Future Super distressed rate newspaper ad and get you to tell us what happened.
We ran a campaign called Not Business as Usual as a company. And it was part of working with the student strikers for climate. The idea was that we really wanted to support those student strikers. And one of the ways we could see that was by challenging other businesses to join us in saying, well, this is a strike. These strikes will be more effective if your business makes it possible and easy for your staff to join your kids, the students, at the strikes. And by doing so, it'll help to raise the amount of people who can attend those strikes. I think they doubled in size or something like that. They were huge. And part of the reason for that was that more parents were able to support and come along to that strike with them. And it's because a coalition of hundreds of businesses came together as part of Not Business as Usual to make that okay for staff. Yeah. Sent out messages to their staff saying, it's okay if you want to take that time off. If you want to take an extended lunch break or a full day off, it's all fine. That's part of what this is about. Internally at the time, saying that you want to invest a lot in a campaign, that's all about having those outcomes. Like, it doesn't have a direct profit outcome.
Yeah,
you've just got to trust that actually this is so good for us as a brand and as a company for people to see us supporting something like this. But actually, yeah, people will want to follow through on that support and they will join you as a result. Like, they'll want to be a part of a company that does big, bold actions like that.
100%.
But it wasn't something that we had 100% agreement on at a board level at the time. And it wasn't just myself. Kirsten Hunter was one of the other CEOs in the business at the time, and she was very strong on wanting to run this campaign as well. Thankfully, we did, because one of the things that I'm very proud of, I know Kirsten has spoken about being really, really proud of her involvement in that campaign as well. And everybody in the company who was, like, we just went all in on it. We did get a great response from it. The amount of people who joined Future Super following on from that campaign was much greater than the amount of people who were joining beforehand, because we were doing something that was super impactful and in line with what the change they wanted to make. It's like, it's not all just about buying digital ads and trying to squeeze your cost of acquisition down as low as possible. Sometimes it's just doing big, bold things.
We're at a point where 75% of millennials don't trust advertising. And I think when you stand out and you do something different that is bold and business not as usual, then it pays dividends. I guess there's a slight irony in the fact that you ended up leaving Future Super on account of differences with some of the other leadership. I spoke with Amanda Gordon, who was the Chief Marketing Officer at Future Super at the time. And I don't know that you know this, but Amanda told me that she modeled Future Super's voice off yours. And she said, because you have an incredibly clear and unwavering perspective on the role that money should play in the world, and that you communicate that in a really matter-of-fact way. And I think that's somewhat ironic that you end up leaving the brand with your voice because of a disagreement on that front. But I wonder also, can you tell us about the role that you think money should play in the world?
Yeah. And I should say, like, the people who I disagreed with about strategy at Future Super, they all buy into the theory of change that Future Group has. And they really believe in that. And so that's their that's their position. And I think it's an amazing company still. And it does really amazing things, but just had a different strategy of wanting to make change to the one that I had. And I also, like, after 9 years, however long it was, sometimes it's just time to move on anyway. Being a part of a really big business didn't necessarily suit me and my skill set as well anyhow. Being a part of a business that starts to have, like, I don't know, 100 employees. I think they've got like 140 employees now. Like, doesn't suit me as well, when I love to have a personal connection to the people I work with, and I love to be able to show my passion about my work to people around me and get to see their passion. And being a part of something a bit smaller probably does suit that a bit more. But I think I have been very kind of Amanda to say that about the voice. But I think also part of that comes from, I spend a lot of time talking to regular people about investing, whereas I think a lot of people who are in positions of power with money spend a lot of time talking to other very, very wealthy people about money and its power. And they're just very different conversations. It's wild, the difference between what people who are wealthy think might be important to somebody who's not. And I think one of the biggest disconnects comes around this idea that people who invest in stuff only care about financial outcomes from things, as if that's the most important thing to them. It makes it seem as if when you're an investor, you don't live in the same world as the things you invest in, and that you're not a stakeholder of the things that that company does, which is just crazy. Of course, it's really important that our companies that we invest in are mindful of the fact that, yes, we'd like to get financial returns that help us with our financial goals. But at the same time, we also want to live in a safe world and we want to live on a safe planet in safe communities. We want to have outcomes and mobility and all these different things. Those things are really important to us. To say that financial returns sit above all of those other things is just such a weird concept.
Certainly the market or the zeitgeist is changing around us and making those more wealthy decision makers seem a little bit further from centre at the moment. I remember a conversation I had with Macquarie Group a couple of years ago at One Martin Place in Sydney, and they were looking for some information on an up-and-coming startup that had some interesting views from their perspective. And they said to me, we don't know how to make money from millennials. And I laughed, and they didn't respond. They sat there and just blank-faced me. And I said, oh. And they said, no, we're serious. We have no idea how to make money from millennials. And I said, how did you get to work today? And they all said, oh, we all drove. And they parked downstairs in the underground car park. And I said, I walked through Hyde Park. I suggest maybe you give that a go and surround yourself with everyday people. And I talk at great lengths about the finance industry being defined by people who sit in rooms and make decisions for people who aren't in those rooms and who those decisions will affect, but who these people don't have any sort of understanding of whatsoever. I want to talk about Six. What is Six, your new venture, and what problem is it solving?
Yeah, so the problem we're solving is literally that problem you're just talking about, which is, if you're a very wealthy person, you get all sorts of investment opportunities that other people don't have. You have all sorts of different access, but other people don't have. And so the idea behind what we're trying to build with Six is to make it so that everybody has the exact same opportunities, access, and influence that really, really wealthy people have. And a lot of that can come through smaller investments, but acting collectively. And so the idea is we're going to be a platform that allows shareholder activism. By acting together, smaller investors can have as much or more influence than what large investors have. By providing access to unlisted companies and opportunities through things like equity crowdfunding and other types of capital raising or even lending, communities and crowds can get together and make sure that businesses and companies that fit the type of world they want to live in can find access to funding, and maybe even provide access to funding to businesses with founders who don't fit the mold of what normally gets funding, and to provide a shared trading platform that allows impact companies to find a exit opportunity or a liquidity event that allows impact to stay embedded in their business. At the moment, that problem is you grow a business, it gets big, and at some point, the founders and the early investors have to move on or cash out their investment. And the options at the moment are listing on the ASX where the idea is that you've got to treat it as if all shareholders have a financial interest above all others, or to sell out to a big institution who can afford to buy bigger companies. Both of those are very dilutive on impact. So the idea is, can we create an exchange built specifically for these types of companies where impact and things like stakeholder governance is built in and part of the rules of being available on that exchange? So it sounds like a lot that we're building into the same platform, but the overriding thing is that we're trying to give regular investors, people with regular amounts of money, the same ethical investment and investment opportunities as wealthy investors have. And I should say today, what we've started with is shareholder activism.
Can customers buy any shares on your platform?
So on day one, you can only buy shares in listed companies that are targets of our shareholder activism campaigns. So we've got 6 campaigns we started with, and they'll end up being somewhere between 13 to 20 target companies.
Yep.
So on day one, you can buy all of those 20 companies as part of participating in those shareholder activism campaigns. And then from about August, we'll expand it out to the rest of the ASX, and you'll be able to see ethical profiles on those companies before you make a decision to invest in those companies or not.
Let's say it's similar to CommSec or to Stake, but for people who want to be more engaged in what those companies actually do in their everyday activities and the impact they have on the world.
Exactly, yeah. So if you go onto Stake or CommSec, you can see lots of financial information about companies, but you won't really see anything about what is that company's impacts on the world. Is it actually an ethically good, bad, or neutral company? Whereas our platform will help people have that information as well as the financial information. And also, we'll say these companies over here are doing some things that could be improved in terms of climate, the environment, social issues as well. And so if you hold them already, why don't you participate in the shareholder activism campaign? And if you don't hold them already, but you care about that issue, why don't you buy a minimum parcel of shares in that company for the purposes of being part of that campaign? And by doing so, we can work collectively to access shareholder activism tools and force or compel that company to make some of those changes.
Can you give me an example of how Six actually conducts shareholder activism?
Yeah, so the campaign that we've been running since February is a campaign called Save the Skate. So there was a group of NGOs that had been campaigning on this issue for at least 18 months, if not more. And what the issue is that there's this animal called the Maugean skate. It exists only in Macquarie Harbour in Tasmania. And it was around when the dinosaurs were around. So it's one of Australia's oldest creatures. And it's going extinct as a result of salmon farming in Macquarie Harbour. The main purchasers of that salmon from Macquarie Harbour are Woolworths and Coles. What this campaign has been trying to do is, one, influence government to change the rules to not allow farming to happen in Macquarie Harbour, but also been trying to lobby Woolworths and Coles about changing some of their salmon supply away from Macquarie Harbour as a way of trying to save that animal from extinction as well. And so why we got involved from February was that Coles and Woolies were just very dismissive of those NGOs and the other stakeholder groups who are raising this issue. They just weren't being given a voice in the room. But by making it a shareholder activism campaign, those companies are compelled to listen to us. The main tool that gives you is the ability to put a shareholder resolution to their annual general meeting. And through that resolution, you can compel the company to do something, as long as it gets enough support from the rest of the investors in the company. As soon as you have the ability to do that, the company kind of has to sit down with you, talk to you, negotiate with you, because in most cases, they don't want groups putting shareholder resolutions to their AGMs. Usually their AGMs are quite boring affairs and they just want to get them over and done with without any fuss. So since we've been involved in this campaign, we have gotten into the room with Coles, and Woolworths has started responding to us. So just last week, we spoke to Coles, to members of their investor relations team, members of their sustainability executives as well, and talked to them about what they're going to do about the skate. They're actually not doing heaps, I'll be honest. And we had a conversation about the fact that we will be moving to using some of these tools later in the year if they don't respond with the urgency required to save this animal from extinction. And we brought the NGOs into the room with us, someone who hadn't been able to get a response from these companies since September last year. So you're talking about a really imminent extinction event, and they're only talking to their shareholders about it. So the next stages on that campaign are, we will draft a shareholder resolution aimed at those companies. We'll work with those NGOs to make sure that that resolution, the demands in it, match the demands that they want to make, that it's not going to be watered down to make institutional investors happy. And then our team will also work and try and persuade influential institutional investors to vote align with that resolution. And given the focus on nature, I would hope that large super funds and other institutional investors recognize that they should be voting to prevent the companies they invest in causing an extinction event. That's very important in terms of their fiduciary requirements and everything else now as an investor.
I want to actually stick on fiduciary duty. What is it? Explain it to a layperson, a customer that doesn't understand what fiduciary duty is, and then tell us about how it is or isn't getting in the way of solving some really big global problems.
What it says is that if you're a director or a trustee of a company or a fund, that you've got to make decisions in the best financial interests of the people who are invested in your fund or invest in your company.
Hang on, you've told me that people don't just care about financial returns. So that's basically the law says that whoever's responsible for those people's investment, that's all they have to care about. Is that right?
So what it says is you just got to consider people's financial outcomes. So, I mean, if you think about it at its base level, like, yeah, don't go gambling their money away or do something stupid with it. Like, think about people's financial outcomes that they want to achieve. But it doesn't say you got to do that to the exclusion of all other things. And like people have all other things that could be important to do with what the company is doing or what the fund is investing on that require just as much consideration.
I guess it's fair to say you could be really leading the charge on changing what the responsibilities are that directors and trustees have looking out for the interests of people who they're responsible to.
Yeah, and I think part of that comes from engaging stakeholders better and better understanding actually what are the outcomes that they are trying to achieve and what they are happy with, like what is in their financial interest and how do you weigh financial interests against other interests. And I think a really key way to do that is to ensure that other stakeholders, a broad range of stakeholders, can be represented at the levels where you make decisions. People who are trustees and people who are directors, they don't reflect the diversity of people that exist and who are impacted by the actions of companies and institutions.
One of the things that social media gave us was access to companies and to brands and to leaders. But we're seeing in response to controversial developments, we see people flock to social media and leave hundreds and thousands of comments, whether it's Woolworths and Coles during the price gouging investigations, whether it's Fortescue Metals or BHP and the way they behave or fracking. And you see people go to the comments section and it's really easy for these companies to just ignore that or turn off comments. I think it's almost the next evolution to give people in a community access to really drive change and get in the room. So I think that's really exciting. Now, you're raising money at the moment from the crowd on virtual. Can you tell us why?
Yeah, so we just raised some money in a more traditional way from wholesale investors and sophisticated investors. And we've followed that up with raising money from the crowd. So what it means is anybody has the ability to invest and become an owner of SIX. So what it does is it broadens out by a long way the amount of people who have the opportunity to be owners in our company. And importantly, what it means is it's more likely that the people who own SIX are also likely to be the people who want to participate in our campaigns, also more likely to be the people who are going to use our platform, and more likely to be the sort of people who care a whole lot about SIX existing and its importance, and probably have expectations that we will put. So I think that's really important to us, is that we want our share register to reflect the diversity of people who are using our platform, which is one way of helping make sure that we make decisions as a company as we grow that reflects the people who are users as a stakeholder.
Now, we're sort of coming to the end of our time. I want to finish with one question. If you could change one thing in the world, what would it be?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, isn't it? Because there's so many big things you could change. I think the answer I want to give is a billionaire shouldn't exist. And maybe the bar should be set lower than billionaires. But the idea that we allow people to keep extracting with no limit is just absurd. That is not compatible with a world where we have a safe planet and great communities and where people value things. That's outside of financial returns. That's something that has a minority of people extracting from everybody else. I think if there were limits on the amount of wealth that any individual person could have, that individual corporations could have, that would make a big change to how we make decisions on all sorts of different things. No more billionaires.
Adam, thank you so much for your time. If anyone wants to get behind Six, they can go to birchall.com and have a look at the crowdfund at the moment.
So we're open until Thursday the 27th at 10 p.m. And also, if you're generally interested in any of the shareholder campaigns that we're running, jump over to our website, which is six-invest.com.au. We're running 6 campaigns at the moment. Some of them are nature-based. Some of them are around deforestation. We've got a paid parental leave campaign that we're running that I think is going to be really popular. So jump on there, join one campaign, join them all. It'd be great to have lots of people come and get a voice in the boardrooms of Australia's biggest companies.
And that's it for today's episode. As always, thanks so much for listening. If you enjoy the show, please remember that sharing it on social media with your thoughts is a really valuable way to support us. If you haven't already, please rate and review the show on your chosen podcast platform. These are the things that help us bring you the world's most impressive thinkers, and it helps us on our journey toward erasing financial inequality, one of humanity's greatest threats today.